The woods have always been a place of mystery, isolation, and fear. Some who enter never return. Others bring back stories that chill the bone and haunt the mind. Tonight, you'll hear 5 of the most terrifying wood stories ever told. But be warned, you might not look at the forest the same way again. Before we dive into the darkness, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because you never know when the next nightmare will arrive. And if you've ever had a creepy experience in the woods, drop it in the comments below. We dare you. John had spent his life hunting. The woods were familiar, predictable. He knew how the wind carried scent, how the animals moved before a storm. Out here, he felt at home. But tonight, the woods felt different. He was deep in the heart of the Blackwood Forest, tracking a buck that had left impossibly large hoofprints in the fresh snow. The air was deathly still, heavy with the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Even the usual rustling of nocturnal creatures was absent. John had seen strange things before: a deer with missing eyes, a fox that twisted its head too far, but he'd always found a way to explain them. Nature was cruel. It was imperfect, but it was never unnatural. His rifle was steady in his hands as he crouched near a tree, scanning the area. That's when he saw it, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its outline flickered, as if it wasn't entirely solid. John sucked in a breath and lifted his rifle, but the second his finger touched the trigger, the thing moved. Not in a way an animal should. No cautious step, no natural shift of weight. It simply disappeared. A whisper carried through the trees. "Hunter!" John swung his flashlight wildly. The voice was close, too close. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wasn't a man easily scared, but something about this was wrong. Then, the trees moved. Not from wind. Not from an animal. They swayed, bending unnaturally, parting like something enormous was making its way through them. The buck he had been tracking burst from the brush, its body twisted, its legs bending in ways they shouldn't. It let out a choked, guttural cry as it crashed into the undergrowth. John turned and ran. He wasn't ashamed of it. Some things in the woods weren't meant to be faced. He sprinted through the snow, branches slashing at his face, his boots crunching loudly with every step. His truck was a mile away. If he could make it there. A shadow cut across the moonlight. John skidded to a stop. The figure was in front of him now, its body half hidden by the trees. No eyes, no mouth, just a suggestion of a face, a stretched, hollowed shape that mimicked human features without fully understanding them. It reached out a long, bony arm. "Hunter," it said again. The voice was inside his head now, crawling into his mind like a parasite. "You take from us." John fumbled for his rifle, but his arms felt weak. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. The forest around him felt smaller, closing in, pressing against his skin. Then he heard another voice. It sounded like his father. "John, come home. It's safe now." Tears burned his eyes. His father had been dead for 10 years. Something cold gripped his wrist. John let out a strangled cry and wrenched himself free, running blindly. He didn't stop until he reached his truck, throwing himself inside and locking the doors. His hand shook as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but his headlights only revealed darkness. The road was gone. Only trees remained. Then something knocked on his window, slow, rhythmic. 3 taps. John squeezed his eyes shut. When he opened them, The forest was back, the road stretching out in front of him, like nothing had ever changed. He floored the gas pedal, speeding out of Blackwood, swearing never to return. But as he reached his driveway hours later, something whispered from the woods behind his house. Hunter. And John knew, no matter how far he ran, the hollow stalker had already claimed him. Officer Daniel Reeves had been patrolling the back roads of Pine Hollow for years. It was a sleepy town, the kind where people left their doors unlocked and waved at passing cars. Nothing much happened here, except on the stretch of road that cut through Blackwood Forest. They called it Dead Man's Curve. The locals warned newcomers never to stop along that road at night. Reeves had always laughed it off, small-town superstition, until the night he pulled over a car that shouldn't have been there. It was just past 1 a.m. when he spotted the vehicle, a rusted-out sedan parked on the shoulder. No headlights, no hazard lights. The engine was off, and the windows were dark. Something about it felt wrong. Reeves pulled up behind it, radioing in his location. "Dispatch, I've got an abandoned vehicle on Route 19 near Dead Man's Curve. Running plates now." He typed in the license plate number. No matches. Frowning, he stepped out, flashlight in hand. The cold air pressed in around him as he approached the driver's side window. He knocked twice. "Pine Hollow PD, everything all right in there?" Silence. Reeves reached for the door handle. Before he could pull, the window slid down an inch. A voice whispered from inside, "You shouldn't be here." A chill crawled up his spine. The voice was strained, like it was coming from deep inside the throat. Reeves angled his flashlight into the car, but the inside was empty. No driver, no passengers, just an old cassette tape sitting on the driver's seat, turning slowly as if recently used. He stepped back, hand on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The voice came again, but this time it came from behind him. "Officer!" Reeves spun, his light cutting through the darkness. The road behind him was empty. The trees loomed like silent witnesses, their branches creaking softly in the wind. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled. Static. Then, "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't dispatch. It was his own voice. Reeves' pulse pounded. He turned back to the car, but the door was open now. The cassette tape was gone. The seat was empty, except for a small folded piece of paper. With shaking fingers, he picked it up. 3 words were scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Look in the trunk." Everything inside him screamed to get in his cruiser and leave, but his training overrode the fear. He circled to the back of the car, breath misting in the freezing air. His gloved hands found the trunk release. He lifted it slowly. Inside was a uniform, a police uniform, just like his. The badge pinned to the chest read, "Officer Daniel Reeves." Reeves staggered back, stomach twisting. His radio crackled again. This time, it was dispatch. "Reeves, what's your status?" The voice was clear, real, grounding. He fumbled for the radio. "Dispatch, I need backup." There's a soft whisper in his ear. Too late. Pain exploded in his chest. Reeves gasped, stumbling forward, gripping at his shirt. But there was no wound, no blood. Just an unbearable cold sinking into his bones. His vision blurred. The world spun. Then everything went black. When he woke, he was sitting in the driver's seat of the rusted sedan. The radio was off. The road was empty. His patrol car was gone. He reached for his badge, for his gun. But they weren't there. He wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. Instead, A crumpled piece of paper sat in his lap. The same jagged handwriting. Do not stop. As he looked up, headlights appeared in the distance. A police cruiser was pulling up behind him. A familiar officer stepped out, and he knocked on the window. Reeves opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The officer leaned down, flashlight shining into the car. It was his own face staring back at him. Then the window rolled down an inch. You shouldn't be here. The woods beyond Black Ridge were the kind that swallowed sound. No bird sang there. No wind rustled the trees. Just an expanse of towering pines, their trunks blackened by age, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like fingers grasping for something unseen. The locals avoided it. We should have too. It was supposed to be a weekend trip. Me, my brother Nate, his girlfriend Lila, and our friend Marcus. We were seasoned hikers, not the kind to get spooked easily. When we set up camp deep in the hollow forest, I told myself the uneasy feeling in my gut was just exhaustion from the hike. That first night, we built a fire and told stories. Nothing seemed wrong. Not yet. But then the whispers started. Soft, almost imperceptible, just beyond the ring of firelight. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. I glanced at the others. Nate was poking at the fire, oblivious. Lila was shifting nervously. Marcus had gone stiff. Did you hear that? He murmured. I nodded. Lila swallowed hard and leaned in. It sounded like a twig snapped behind us. We spun around, flashlights sweeping through the blackness. Nothing, just the endless forest. The uneasy silence stretched on, swallowing even the crackling of our fire. Let's get some sleep, Nate finally said, forcing a chuckle. Probably just an animal. We turned in for the night, but sleep never came easy. I lay there listening, straining to hear past the sound of my own breathing. And then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Whispers, right outside the tent. Low and garbled, like a voice distorted through water. My blood went cold. I turned to wake Nate, but he was already sitting up, eyes wide, clutching his knife. The whispers grew louder. I reached for the zipper to peek outside, but before I could, something heavy moved through the trees. Slow, deliberate, a long, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the undergrowth. Then came the laughter. It was close, too close, echoing all around us. But there was something wrong with it. It wasn't real laughter. It was an imitation. A sound made by something that didn't understand what laughter was supposed to be. Nate grabbed my arm. We need to go. Now. We scrambled out of the tent. Lila and Marcus were already outside, pale and trembling. Something's in the trees, Marcus whispered. It's watching us. We grabbed our gear and doused the fire. As soon as the flames died, the whispers came rushing back, closer than before. The laughter followed, shifting, growing distorted, stretching into something inhuman. We ran. The forest was endless. Our flashlights barely cut through the dark, and the ground seemed to pull at our feet. The whispers moved with us, darting ahead, flanking us, a chorus of voices we didn't recognize. Then, suddenly, Marcus screamed. I turned just in time to see something yank him backward into the trees. Something pale, something with arms too long and fingers that curled like hooks. His scream was swallowed by the dark, and then silence. We didn't stop running. We couldn't. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but we had to keep moving. We didn't stop until we burst from the trees, collapsing onto the dirt road where our car was parked. Only then did we dare to look back. The trees loomed in the darkness, unmoving, silent. The forest had taken Marcus, and it had given us nothing in return. But just as I fumbled for my keys, just as I yanked the car door open, I heard it again. The whisper, right at my ear. "You left him behind." I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the woods, stretching on forever. We never found Marcus. And I don't think the forest ever meant to let him go. The whispers in the woods. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A deer, standing just at the tree line, watching. But there was something wrong with it. Its legs were too long, its eyes too dark, too human. It didn't move like an animal should. It swayed slightly, as if unsure how to balance its own weight. We were camping deep in the Black Hollow Forest, miles away from civilization. Just me, my brother Jake, and our friend Will. We were used to hiking, used to the deep woods, the silence of nature. But something about that night was off. The air was too still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Jake noticed it first. "You see that? That deer?" he whispered, voice tight. Will and I turned just as it took a step forward, but the way it moved, it didn't walk, it jerked, like a puppet with tangled strings. My stomach twisted. "Maybe it's sick," Will murmured, but he didn't sound convinced. None of us were. We decided to ignore it, pretend it was just some weird trick of the moonlight. But later that night, inside the tent, we heard it. Scratching. Light. Deliberate. Right along the fabric. Jake unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, and shined it outside. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. Just that same eerie stillness. Then, just as he turned off the light, we heard it. A voice. "Jake." It came from just beyond the trees. A whisper. But it wasn't quite right. It was his own name, but stretched, distorted, like someone unfamiliar with the shape of words. My blood ran cold. Jake stiffened, his breathing shallow. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Will and I nodded, too scared to speak. Then, suddenly, the voice again, closer. "Jake, help me." I knew then that we needed to leave. Now, whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wanted us to think it was. We grabbed only what we could carry and bolted. Running through the woods in the dead of night is a nightmare on its own. But hearing something crashing behind us, something faster than it should have been, something giggling in a way no animal ever would, it made my legs burn with panic. We made it to the car just as something burst from the trees. I turned back for only a second, just long enough to see a figure, tall and thin, with skin stretched too tight over a face that was almost human. Almost. We sped away, gravel flying, too afraid to look back. But as we drove, I swear I saw it in the rearview mirror, standing in the road, head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it was smiling. We never went back. It started with a missing dog. We were 5 days into our backpacking trip through Raven's Hollow, a stretch of dense wilderness notorious for being untouched by civilization. Just me, my girlfriend Sam, her brother Mike, and our friend Eric. No cell service, no roads for miles. The perfect isolation. We wanted adventure, but what we found was something else, something watching. On the third night, Mike's dog, Ranger, went missing. 1 minute he was dozing by the fire, the next he was gone. No barking, no yelp, just gone. We searched with flashlights, calling his name until our voices went hoarse. The woods swallowed the sound. Then, around 2 a.m., we heard it. A low whimper, deep in the trees. Faint, Wrong. Sam clutched my arm. That's not Ranger, she whispered. Her face was pale in the firelight. Mike didn't listen. He bolted into the dark, flashlight bouncing in his hand. We had no choice but to follow. The whimpering grew louder, but the way it echoed was unnatural, as if the trees themselves were mimicking the sound. My gut twisted. We called for Mike, but our voices felt small in the endless blackness. Then, snap. Something heavy moved just ahead. Our flashlights caught glimpses of shifting figures between the trees. Tall, gaunt, their limbs too long, their joints bending wrong. They stood still, watching, unblinking. Then, in perfect unison, they stepped back into the shadows. Mike stumbled into a clearing, panting, looking around wildly. "Did you see that? Did you?" A voice interrupted him. A whisper, close enough to make my skin crawl. "Help me!" It came from the treetops. We pointed our lights up. Something clung to the branches, its body contorted, its head turned upside down. It had Ranger's shape, but its eyes were hollow. Its mouth too wide, curled into a sick grin. "Help me!" it repeated, but this time it was in Mike's voice. Panic set in. "Run!" I screamed, yanking Sam's arm. Eric was frozen in place, staring, until something darted toward him. It moved like a glitch in reality, jittering forward in bursts of unnatural speed. Fingers wrapped around his wrist, but they weren't fingers. They were something else. Eric shrieked, and we yanked him free, sprinting back to camp. Behind us, the whispering grew louder. Dozens of voices, all overlapping, all wrong. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" We didn't stop until we reached the fire. Mike collapsed to his knees, sobbing, staring into the darkness where the figures had been. But they were gone. Ranger never came back. Neither did Eric. We left the next morning, hiking in silence, refusing to acknowledge the whispering we still heard behind us. The thing in the trees wasn't done watching. The woods have always been a place of mystery, where shadows move and whispers carry through the trees. If these stories have left you uneasy, remember, the forest never forgets those who fear it. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because there are more nightmares waiting in the dark. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the woods, share it in the comments below. We're always watching.